Hello folks, Prasad Domala here. In this video, I'll show you how to set up a continuous deployment environment using AWS services and GitHub. So let's get started. I'll be using AWS CodePipeline, AWS CodeDeploy and GitHub as primary components in this particular setup. I'll also be using some supporting services like EC2, S3, ALB, that is Application Load Balancer, and IAM. And for this demo, I'll be using a simple Node.js Express web application. Let me show you my current environment first. I have two EC2 instances, which will be my web servers running Node.js Express application. Next, I have a load balancer target group, which will send traffic to my EC2 instances in round robin mode. And I also have an application load balancer, which will be internet facing. You're free to have an internal one if you wish. And the ALB will be sending the traffic to target group, which will in turn send the request to my backend EC2 instances. Now let me show you the flow of our continuous deployment setup. First, the developers or the application team will make changes to the code and push the code to GitHub repo. And then this will trigger the code pipeline, which pulls the code from GitHub and stores it in S3. Next, code deploy application will be triggered using the source as input. And CodeDeploy will then deploy the code to the backend EC2 instances within the target group one at a time. We'll also be assigning service roles for CodePipeline and CodeDeploy, and an instance profile will be attached to our backend EC2 instances. I'm logged into my AWS management console, and these are my EC2 instances. And these are just basic Amazon Linux instances launched using the base Amazon Linux AMI. So nothing related to my sample application is installed on these machines. We'll install all our prerequisites like NPM as part of our continuous deployment pipeline. Coming to the target groups, I have my EC2 instances registered as targets on port 3000, which is the default port. For health checks, I have my healthy and unhealthy count as 2, and I have my application load balancer here with port 80 as the listen port, and it is internet facing. And for listeners, I have my target group assigned as listener. Coming to my sample application, I have Node.js Express app created. So this is the default app with just app.js, and it will just show us a welcome message. I have this application on my GitHub repository called as cd demo-node.js, and we'll be using this repo as source in our code pipeline. So that's my initial setup. Now let's have a look at the steps we need to perform to set up a continuous deployment environment. First, we need to prepare our application to work with CodeDeploy. So we need to create a config file and a couple of scripts that CodeDeploy uses to deploy our application. Next, we need to prepare our EC2 instances to work with CodeDeploy. So for that, we need to install a CodeDeploy agent on our EC2 instances and tag them appropriately. Next, we need to create a service role using IAM. So this role will be assigned to our CodeDeploy application, and it will have permissions to access EC2, autoscaling, and ALB. Next, we need to create an instance profile on IAM, which will be assigning to our EC2 instances. So this instance profile role will have access to S3. So we need this role as CodeDeploy will be storing our code on S3 and will be used during the deployment process. Next, we'll create an application and deployment group in CodeDeploy, where we'll be specifying how the application will be deployed to our EC2 instances. So here we can specify whether we need in place or blue-green deployment methods. And finally, we'll be creating our code pipeline with different stages for source and deploy actions. So these are the steps we need to do to set up a continuous deployment environment. Now let me briefly explain the main stages of our code deploy lifecycle. So code deploy has some predefined stages during which we can execute our custom scripts. So if we don't have a load balancer, we have application stop, download bundle, before install, install, after install, application start, and validate service. If we have a load balancer, we'll have additional stages before and after blocking or allowing traffic. So the stages in red are reserved for code deploy, and we cannot execute our custom scripts during those stages. And for the stages in green, we can execute our custom scripts. Here the install stage is actually copying our application code to the instances. So if you want to do something before installing, we can do it at before install stage. Or if you want to do after copying our application code, we can do it during after install stage. And we can put all our application startup and shutdown scripts in application stop and application start stages. And any validations of the application can be done during the validate service stage. So for our demo, I'll be using before install, after install, application start, application stop, and validate service stages. So each stage will have a script associated with it, and we can put all our commands in those scripts. So here under the root of my application source, I have created a directory called as CodeDeploy, and I have placed all my CodeDeploy specific scripts into that particular directory. In the before install script, I am doing the cleanup by deleting any existing application directories and creating a new fresh directory. And I'm installing the prerequisites. We obviously need NodeJS, and I'm installing it using yum here. And I'm also installing PM2 to manage my process. You can install any other application prerequisites during this particular stage using this script. In after install script, I'm just navigating to my application directory and running npm install command. So note that our application is already copied to the destination directory by the time we reach this particular stage. The app start script contains my startup commands. I'm using PM2 to start my application. And similarly, the app underscore stop.sh script will have my shutdown commands. And again, I'm using PM2 to stop my Node.js application. And finally, in validate service script, I'm just checking if the port is listening or not using netstat command. So these are the scripts we'll be using in different stages of code deploy. Next, we need to define CodeDeploy config file, and it is called as appspec.yaml. And this file should be in your application root directory, and CodeDeploy reads this file while deploying our application. So as you can see, this file has three sections: files, permissions, and hooks. So in the file section, we need to specify the source and destination of our application code. So in my case, the source will be / which is my application root or repository root, and destination is /user /cd demo. This will be my application root on my EC2 instance. Next, we have permissions section. Here I'm just changing the permissions of my shell scripts by providing execute permissions to the root user. I'm providing 755 permissions. Next is the hooks section. In this section, we'll be defining the location of the scripts for each stage. So this location is relative to appspec.yaml file. So the location will be CodeDeploy / the script name. And I'm giving the timeout as 180 seconds for each stage. You can change it based on the time your scripts take to complete. So that's the preparation we need to do in our application source before using it with a code deploy. So this is mostly one-time activity unless you are changing your scripts or lifecycle stages in your application revisions. Next, we need to install CodeDeploy agents on our EC2 instances. So let me log into my EC2 instance. And CodeDeploy agent can be installed using yum if you're using Amazon Linux or RHEL. So if you use Ubuntu, you can install using apt like any other Linux package. So one prerequisite for this CodeDeploy agent is Ruby. So first let's install Ruby using yum-y install Ruby. We also need wget to download the agent install scripts. If you don't have it on your instance, install it using yum-y install wget. On Amazon Linux, I already have wget installed. Now we need to download the install scripts using wget, and the URL for that would be https AWS CodeDeploy and then your region.s3.amazonaws.com and then /latest/install. So you can change this URL based on your region. So next, let's give permissions to the install script using chmod +x and then install. Now we can execute this script using install and then auto. So this will install CodeDeploy agent on our EC2 instance. Now let's start the agent using service CodeDeploy agent start. We can check the status using service CodeDeploy agent status. So our CodeDeploy agent is running on this first instance. So let me do the same on my other instance as well. I'll speed up the video while I'm doing that. Okay, now the CodeDeploy agent is installed and started on both my EC2 instances. Next, we need to tag our instances for CodeDeploy to identify our instances. So for this demo, I'll create a tag called CodeDeploy group and I'll give the value as NodeJS. So from my console, I'll add a new tag called as CodeDeploy group and the value I'll give it as Node.js. I'll create the tag on my second instance as well with the same value. So we'll be using this tag while creating our deployment group in CodeDeploy. Next, let's go to IAM console and create a CodeDeploy service role. So let's go to roles and then create role and select CodeDeploy as our service and then select CodeDeploy again and then click on next permissions. Here we have a pre-built role called as AWS CodeDeploy role. If you open this role to check the permissions, you can see permissions for auto scaling, EC2, and then CloudWatch alarms and Elastic load balancing. So these are the permissions required for CodeDeploy to deploy our code to EC2 instances. So click review here. I'll call my role as CodeDeploy service role and then click on create role. So we have our service role created. Next, we need to create an instance profile for our EC2 instances. So let's go to policies and click on create policy. I'll go to JSON editor and then copy my policy statement here. So we are basically allowing access to get and list S3 objects using this policy. Click on review policy. I'll call my policy as EC2 instance profile policy and then click on create policy. So our instance profile policy is created. Now we need to create a role based on this policy. So go back to roles again and then click role. So now we'll be selecting EC2 and then EC2 again and then go to permissions. Search for the policy we just created, which is EC2 instance profile policy. Select that and then review. I'll call this role as EC2 instance profile role and then click on create role. So now our EC2 instance profile role is created. Now let me assign this instance profile role to our EC2 instances. So I'll go back to my EC2 console. So select my instance, and then go to actions, instance settings, attach or replace IAM role, and I'll select my new role here, which is EC2 instance profile role, and then apply. I'll do the same for my second instance as well. Instance settings, attach or replace IAM role, and select EC2 instance profile role. So now both our instances have the instance profile attached. Now we need to restart our instances. So this is required specifically for CodeDeploy. So if we don't restart our instances, CodeDeploy will complain that the instances were not started with instance profile. So I'll restart these instances. So I'll speed up the video while this is happening. Okay, now both my EC2 instances are restarted. Now let's create our CodeDeploy application. So let me go to CodeDeploy console and then click on get started. So here we'll have two options, the sample deployment and the custom deployment. So sample deployment will deploy a sample application, but we'll be using our own application using GitHub. So I'll select custom deployment here and then click on skip walkthrough. So for application name, I'll just call it as my NodeJS app. The compute platform will be EC2 or on-premises. Note that we can use CodeDeploy for on-premise servers as well. And we can also use CodeDeploy to deploy our AWS Lambda functions. So for this demo, the compute platform will be EC2 or on-premises. And then for deployment group name, I'll give it as my web deployment group. So a deployment group is nothing but the group of servers you wish to deploy this particular application. So we can deploy the same application to multiple group of servers, in which case we'll be creating multiple deployment groups within the same application. Next we have deployment type, and CodeDeploy supports in place and blue-green deployments. So I'm not explaining about these deployment types in detail in this video, but in a nutshell, in place deployment updates the existing instances with your new application version, and the blue-green deployment type will create new instances and replaces the existing ones, and the old instances will be terminated. So you can choose appropriate deployment method based on the nature and criticality of your application. For this demo, I'll choose in place deployment. And next is the environment configuration, and we have three options here. So we can specify autoscaling group or EC2 instances or on-premise instances. You can also specify a combination of these, so you can deploy the application to autoscaling group, EC2 instances, and on-premise instances using the same CodeDeploy application. So in our case, for this demo, it will be Amazon EC2 instances, and we need to specify a tag to identify our instances. So here I'll select the tab which we created earlier in this video, which is CodeDeploy group, and then the value will be Node.js. So you can see the list of instances matching those tag values. So we have two instances here. Next, we need to specify the load balancer. So if you're not using load balancer, you can skip this step. So for this demo, I'll select enable load balancing, as I have my ALB created for my application. And then from the drop down here, select your target group. So I have only one target group, which is CD demo target group. I'll select that. Next is the deployment configuration. And we have three options here: one at a time, half at a time, and all at once. I'll go with one at a time for this demo, so which will deploy your application code on one instance at a time. And finally, we need to select the CodeDeploy service role, which we created earlier. So I'll select my CodeDeploy service role, which is CodeDeploy service role. And now we can click on create application. So our application is created now, which is my Node.js app. And that's the configuration required on CodeDeploy. And the final step is to create the pipeline itself. So let's go to our CodePipeline console. And then click on get started. So I'll call my pipeline as my Node.js app pipeline and then click on next. For the source provider, I'll select GitHub. You can use S3 or code commit as well as your source, but for this demo I'll go with GitHub. And then let's click on connect to GitHub, and it will ask for my credentials. If you're already logged in, it will directly show you the list of repositories. So if you're not logged into GitHub earlier on your browser, it will ask you for the credentials. So from the repository, I'll select my repository, which is cd demo-node.js, and then I'll select the branch. So we have only one branch, which is master, and then click on next. Next is selection of build provider. For this application, we don't need any build, so I'm just selecting no build here. But if your app requires any build before deploying, you can use available Jenkins, CodeBuild, or Solano CI build providers. So for this demo, I'll go with no build, and next. Next, we need to select the deployment provider. So in our case, it will be CodeDeploy. You can also use ECS, CloudFormation, or Elastic Beanstalk as your deployment provider. I'll go with CodeDeploy here. And then we need to select our CodeDeploy application name, which we just created, which is my Node.js app. And then the deployment group, which will be my web deployment group. So select your application name and deployment group, and then click next. So next we need to provide a service role for CodePipeline as well. So I have my CodePipeline service role already created, but if you don't have one, you can just click on create role and provide a name, and the service role will be created. So for this demo, I'll select my existing CodePipeline service role and then click on next. So this is your review page. So review all your settings here and then click on create pipeline. So now we have our pipeline created, and we have created and configured all the components required for our continuous delivery setup. So as you can see, the source stage automatically started. So it will now pull the code from your GitHub repository and deploy to our backend EC2 instances. So I'll be speeding up the video in between while it is in progress. As you can see, our source stage is now complete, and now it's executing the staging stage or the deploy stage, which will start our CodeDeploy application. So if we go to our CodeDeploy console and just refresh it, so we can see that our deployment is in progress. You can click on the deployment ID, and as you can see, it is deploying one at a time. So the deployment is in progress on the first instance, and you can click on view events here to see all the events that are happening in this deployment lifecycle. So these are the events which we discussed earlier in this video. As you can see, all the events are succeeded on our first instance. Now if we go back to our deployment, you can see it's successful on our first instance, and the deployment is in progress on our second instance. So you can view the events again. Okay, the deployment is successful on our second instance as well. So if we go to our deployment, it is successful on both the instances. If we go back to our pipeline, it should be all green. It will take a minute to update this page. Now if we access our application using the ALB URL, we should be able to see our application, which says v1. Now I'll modify the code. I'll just make the version as v2 and push it to the repository. So now the pipeline should be triggered automatically, and it should deploy the new version of our application. So I'll speed up the video here, and once the whole deployment is complete, I'll show you the updated application. As you can see, it started our source stage. Now it will download the new version of our application and deploy it to both are EC2 instances. Okay, now the deployment is successful on both our EC2 instances. Now if we refresh our application, we should be seeing our new version, which is V2. Now if we go back to our code pipeline, we should see that the pipeline is complete now. So here you can add more stages and manual approvals to your pipeline as per your application requirements. So you can add additional stages to deploy to your staging environment or production environment, and you can add manual approvals in between. So that is the end-to-end process to set up a continuous deployment environment using AWS CodePipeline and CodeBuild. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit that like button down below and subscribe to my channel for more videos on AWS. So if you have any questions, please post in the comments. Have a good day and see you in the next one.